I borrowed $5,000 from my best friend for an urgent emergency. But the truth is my boyfriend invited me on a trip to Brazil, and I had to pay for it myself. The problem is he saw my stories and just texted me asking for his money back. What should I do? I'm in Brazil with sand stuck to my legs, my phone vibrating like a fire alarm. Simon just texted me asking for the $5,000, and the message has that tone of, "I'm gonna bring you back to reality." That ruins any aesthetic. I should be uploading another story in golden, not justifying my existence. Anyway, for you to understand why he's acting like this, I'll tell you how this mess started. Simon and I have been friends since childhood, one of those bonds that survive moves, schools, and weird phases, but also one of those that gets distorted when you start growing in different directions. He's disciplined with schedules, always prioritizing, mentally noting every expense, as if life were a factory and you had to clock in. I always found that sweet, even admirable, but also limiting, because I don't think about money like him. I think of it as expansion energy. If I tell him a plan, he dismantles it with numbers. If I tell him a dream, he brings it down with percentages, and yet he's always been there, that friend who lends you his calm when you don't have it. Over time, I built my digital entrepreneur identity, not just for vanity, but because it's a real market and people don't understand it until they see results. My life is content, my decisions impact my reach, and my habits align with the image I project because the audience doesn't buy improvisation. I curate my photos, my posting schedule, my style, my stories, the vibe of everything I show. It's not superficiality, it's brand consistency. Simon, on the other hand, believes what's important is what you don't see. The savings account, the emergency fund, the just in case. Sometimes he looks at me as if I were a teenager playing adult, when in reality, I'm an adult playing immense. That's why when I started dating Brian, Simon gave me that silently worried look he thinks is discreet. Brian is the type of man who walks into a room and you feel his presence, even if he doesn't have an expensive suit or speak with technical words. He has that raw urban aesthetic that works like a magnet on my feed because it contrasts perfectly with my curation. I'm the polished one, he's the authentic one, and together we create a story. At first, I loved that he didn't live thinking about what will they say, like Simon, because that's contagious and makes you a coward. Brian isn't afraid of the street, loud music, spontaneous plans. With him, everything seems more alive, but from the beginning, I also noticed that Brian and I played a different power game than I was used to. He doesn't promise, he insinuates, he throws out ideas like hooks, he says, "Let's go," as if that's enough for the world to conform. Sometimes I interpreted that as confidence and sometimes as irresponsibility disguised as charisma. However, the problem is that mix hooks you. It makes you feel like you're the one who turns chaos into something presentable. I told myself I was the one providing creative direction and he was the one providing street cred, and that combination was gold. Simon, of course, saw the risk before the narrative. My dynamic with Simon had always been more stable, if I'm honest, a bit asymmetrical. He listens to me, advises me, grounds me, and I give him excitement, tell him gossip, pull him out of his responsibility bubble. When I was down, he appeared with solutions, not speeches. If I needed someone to take me somewhere or accompany me to something uncomfortable, he'd do it without asking for anything in return. That kind of friendship creates a dangerous trust, because you get used to the other person enduring more than they should. I saw him as a pillar, and pillars in one's mind are for holding things up. I never thought of him as someone who could get tired, because he's not dramatic and non-dramatic people give the false impression that everything rolls off their backs. Brian, on the other hand, was always more about image than structure, though he'd never say it that way. He understands aesthetics, he understands impact, he understands what it means to be looked at. Only his approach is more instinctive. I love that he let himself be filmed without stiffening up, that he didn't ask, "What's this for?" That he simply got into the mood. I began to imagine that if he aligned with my vision, we could grow fast and strong, like those couples who become a brand in themselves. And that's not a fantasy, that happens. Only people don't admit it requires strategy. I felt I was one good decision away from turning my content into something international. That's why, when he proposed we go to Rio de Janeiro to create international content, I felt it was the most obvious sign in the world. Not a mystical sign, but a market signal. Brazil sells, the beach sells, cultural contrast sells, and people love to see someone living what they aren't living. It was a positioning leap, an upgrade, a way to show that my life wasn't staying local. I knew a trip like that would elevate my feed and also my authority. International content has a different flavor. It wasn't just tourism, it was growth strategy. And when you're building something, time matters more than comfort. The tiny, annoying detail was that Brian didn't have liquidity, and neither did I. It wasn't that I was poor, it was that I was at that stage where money moves, flowing in and out of projects, and you don't let it sit because it doesn't grow idle. I had already committed expenses, things that can't be paused if you want to maintain consistency. And besides, I wasn't going to let Brian feel like I couldn't sustain a big plan. He's attracted to security, even if he acts like he doesn't care. And I, honestly, wasn't going to lose that moment over an accounting issue. That's when I thought of Simon, because Simon is the only one who has money, still, saved, breathing in an account as if oxygen were a goal. I knew if I told him the truth, he'd give me a lecture on priorities and responsibility. And what I needed was speed, not a financial therapy session. I also knew he's sensitive about health issues, because his family has been through things, and that kind of sensitivity softens him. I don't feel like a villain for understanding how a person works. That's emotional intelligence. Besides, I was going to pay him back, just not on the rigid schedule that reassures him. My urgency was real, even if it wasn't medical. So I told him about an urgent emergency involving surgical intervention, something serious enough that he wouldn't ask invasive questions, but general enough that he couldn't verify. I told him just enough for him to react as he always reacts, by solving. And he solved it, because in no time he transferred $5,000 from his savings with that speed he only has when he thinks he's saving someone. I felt immediate relief, as if the universe had approved my credit without bureaucracy. In my head, that was an initial investment for my personal brand, not theft or abuse. People invest in businesses they believe in, and I'm my business. The trip started with that energy that makes you feel like you made the right decision, because everything goes beautifully. Rio is a visual madness. The light, the color, the texture, the street life, the beach that looks like a stage. Brian was happy, and when he's happy, he becomes more affectionate, more attentive, less burdensome, as if the world finally had the music he needs. I felt like every minute was material, every angle could be a clip, every look could be a story. And yes, we toasted, because that's also part of the narrative, freedom, enjoyment. I deserve it. I don't like to fake austerity when I'm literally building aspiration. In Copacabana, in that golden hour that seems designed for influencers, I got carried away by the emotion and uploaded a series of stories toasting with caipirinhas, laughing, showing the sea, showing Brian with that music video vibe. I was happy and I showed it. Because if something's going well for you, you share it. And if you don't share it, the algorithm punishes you and people forget you. In my head, I was doing my job. The problem is I forgot to hide Simon's stories because I'd been in content mode and not damage control mode. Sometimes you can't be everywhere, and people don't understand that. I saw Simon's message when it was too late to pretend it didn't exist. It wasn't a "how are you? I'm glad to see you well." It went straight to what he believes is reality, demanding his money, as if being on a beach eliminated any right I have to breathe. The tone was cold with that passive-aggressive aggression he swears is maturity, and I found it toxic and unsupportive of my career. I felt he was treating me like a criminal for doing exactly what I said I needed to do, to get ahead. And there, phone in hand, the sea in front of me, I knew this trip could turn into a narrative war. Main story comments. Anonymous User 1 says, "You're a con artist with a filter. You lied about surgery to get money from your friend, and then you're outraged he asks for his money back. I hope they charge you for the caipirinha ice." OP's reply, "I'm fascinated by how you talk about scams when you have no idea what it costs to build a brand from scratch. Simon isn't a defenseless old man. He's an adult who chose to help me. And if his help now has emotional conditions, that's his problem, not mine. Besides, no one dies from lending money when they have plenty to keep it idle. What's happening is you hate to see someone living without asking permission." Anonymous User 2 says, "Urgent emergency, and it was for Brian's vacation." You're the kind of friend who ruins lives and then blames the algorithm. Give him back the money before he humiliates you worse. Opie's reply. So dramatic, really. As if I destroyed a central bank. You're inventing the humiliation because you love to see a woman fall, and your complex shows when you mention my boyfriend as if having chemistry with someone is a crime. I'll pay when it's smart to pay, not when a resentful comment orders me to. Update 1. 24 hours have passed since the last update, and I haven't slept well because, in theory, I came to recharge my energy and ended up managing the wounded ego of a man who thinks he owns my destiny because of a transfer. The morning started with that kind of notification that makes your pulse race. Simon had commented on my last photo, and not just any comment, but one designed to explode where it hurts most, on the post with the most engagement. I opened the feed and saw it there like graffiti on a white wall, saying if the operation was for a tan implant, and that I should give him his money back. It wasn't a private conversation, it was a public attack with the intention of staining my reputation. What angered me most wasn't that he was upset, but that he chose to do it in front of everyone, as if my image were a toy for his moral tantrum. The first thing I did was delete the comment, because I won't allow anyone to sabotage my reputation at the exact moment I'm growing. People think deleting is cowardice, but it's actually crisis control. I don't owe transparency to strangers who consume my life as entertainment. Then I sent him a voice message in the most patient tone I could muster, explaining that my photos were TBT, material from an old trip, and that I was in bed recovering. I even told him my social media team was scheduling content so the algorithm wouldn't punish me, because if you fall out of rhythm, it takes weeks to regain reach. I knew it was a more elaborate story, but he forced me into it with his show. If he wanted to act like a prosecutor, I had to act like a business. While speaking, I felt that mix of anger and superiority that comes out when someone tries to bring me down with mundane things. Simon has always had that worker bee savings mentality, as if the future were an enemy and not a possibility. I told him he should be happy I'm getting ahead, that his money is generating indirect returns because my positioning is growing. He doesn't understand the concept of image investment because his world is summarized in receipts and balances. I ended the audio by emphasizing that his wasn't concern, it was control, and no one controls me. Brand consistency is also about that, not looking weak when attacked. As it was obvious he was seeing everything I uploaded, I decided to block him from my stories. Not out of fear, but out of digital hygiene. You don't invite someone into your house if they come in to criticize your decor. Besides, I needed to enjoy the trip without feeling like he was breathing down my neck from a screen. And yes, I decided not to return the money yet, because it would be strategically stupid to release cash right now when I'm sustaining an experience that keeps Brian motivated. If he gets bored, if he feels this is a failure, he'll make me pay for it with his attitude, and I didn't come to Brazil to babysit anyone's bad mood. My priority was to maintain the trip status so the content would keep flowing. Brian, for his part, woke up with that "today we break free" energy of his, and I had to manage two fronts at the same time. Simon's drama and the logistics of my boyfriend not feeling like we were limited. I talked to him about VIP clubs, about places where people go to see and be seen, because that feeds his ego and honestly, mine too. He told me that in Brazil the vibe was different, that here people live without thinking about tomorrow, and I nodded because deep down that phrase serves me when it's convenient. I knew we didn't have room for big extra expenses, but I also knew a man like him would emotionally leave you if you made him feel poor in a foreign country. The experience had to remain high, even if the budget was strained. I kept telling myself that all this was temporary, that the damage would be fixed with results, and that when I hit a viral clip, everyone would shut up. People underestimate how quickly the internet can change your financial situation if you know how to play it. Simon acts as if money is a stone that only moves with effort, and I know it can move with strategy. Besides, the way he was talking to me was no longer as a friend, but as a debt collector, and that breaks any impulse to be considerate. When someone treats you as guilty before listening, you stop wanting to be kind. I wasn't going to reward his aggression with obedience. However, my crisis management failed due to a technical detail I'm ashamed to admit, not because it's serious, but because it's absurd. I blocked Simon from my stories, convinced that this would close the information leak. But I didn't block Simon's girlfriend because it didn't even cross my mind that she would be monitoring me as if I were a dial who has no life and fills it with the lives of others, and then thinks they have the right to comment. I thought the fence was built and went on with my day as if I had already solved the problem. That was my mistake, underestimating the level of external obsession. In the afternoon, Brian decided to make it clear in his own way that we were living Brazil, and he came up with the idea of doing a live broadcast from where we were with that spontaneity that sometimes adds and sometimes destroys. He turned on the camera without warning, with loud music, people around, and I appeared dancing samba, laughing, and in an impulse I shouted a horrible phrase about poverty. Not because I hate anyone, but because here people exaggerate, so the moment feels epic. In a live broadcast, context is lost and irony doesn't exist, but at the moment I was in the adrenaline. The problem is that the internet doesn't forgive, and the partners of resentful men even less. That live became ammunition. Simon's girlfriend saw it, because of course she saw it, and not only did she see it, but she probably saved it as if she were putting together a file. I realized it when I started receiving weird looks in the comments, as if people had smelled blood. I cut the live broadcast with the excuse of bad signal and told Brian not to be so impulsive, but he laughed as if life was an eternal joke. That's when I felt a nasty irritation because I was sustaining a delicate narrative and he was doing whatever he wanted. Again, I was the one cleaning up the chaos. Not an hour passed, and I already had a message from Simon, this time with open fury, because it was no longer, "I saw your stories." It was, "I saw you live." I responded with a mix of indignation and correction, because it seemed like an absurd invasion that he was at that level of surveillance. I told him that if he were really my friend, he would have messaged me privately without trying to destroy me. I insisted again about the scheduled content, about the old material, about everything, but it was too late because the emotional evidence was already installed. And when a man like Simon feels humiliated, he doesn't seek to understand, he seeks to punish. I've known him since childhood. I know how he gets when he thinks he has the moral high ground. And as if that weren't enough, Simon decided the best way to fix this was to involve my mother. It seems low to me to involve family in an issue that's ultimately between adult friends, but he did it because he knows where it hurts. He sent her screenshots, explained the surgery lie, painted everything as if I were a soulless criminal. My mother, who has the patience of a saint until she feels betrayed, was outraged in 2 seconds. I received her call with that tone that already announces judgment, and she didn't even let me speak properly. There are people who prefer to feel morally correct than to listen to their own daughter. The worst came when she told me she was canceling the emergency credit card I had as a backup, the one that exists precisely for moments when life gets messy. She saw it as an educational punishment, a way to teach me, without understanding that I was in another country, with commitments already made, with an image to maintain, with a boyfriend who doesn't understand restrictions. When she hung up, I stayed staring at the hotel ceiling with a very concrete feeling of emptiness, because it was no longer just Simon's tantrum, it was the entire system closing doors on me. My own family support had been cut off by gossip with screenshots. That's when I had to count the cash, literally, as if I were an unplanned tourist, and that seemed aesthetically humiliating to me. We had just enough, and just enough is a word I'm allergic to because just enough doesn't create experiences, it barely sustains them. I looked at Brian and realized that if he perceived the scarcity, the trip would turn into complaints, long faces, heavy energy. I told him everything was under control, although inside I was already forming a desperate plan, because it's one thing for Simon to be upset and another to be without resources in Brazil. Now I'm in an absurd situation. Simon thinks he's teaching me a lesson. My mother thinks she's correcting me, and I'm trapped between maintaining a brand and maintaining a man who needs constant stimulation. The immediate consequence is that we're in Brazil with the exact cash that came from Simon, no cards, pending bills, and the threat of him escalating further. And if this continues, the next thing he'll do is mess with the brands I tag. And then he really wants to destroy me, not help. I didn't come to Rio to survive. I came to grow, and they're forcing me to operate as if my life were a punishment. Update comments. Anonymous user 1 says, they blocked your reality, and you're still blocking stories. You lied. You were caught live, and you still think you're the victim. Give him back the money before you get stranded for being a clown. OP's reply: what an obsession with seeing me stranded, as if you feed on others' failures. I'm not a criminal for managing my narrative, and if Simon were an emotionally stable man, he wouldn't be making public scandals or calling my mother like a school kid. Money is returned with a clear head, not with panic, and I'm not going to destroy my own positioning for the moralistic impulse of someone who doesn't understand growth. Anonymous User 2 says, your mother did the only sensible thing, cutting off your card so you'd stop playing rich with other people's money. And the live screaming stupidities portrays you more than any screenshot. OP's reply: my mother reacted from drama, not logic, because she also loves to feel right, even if it leaves me in a difficult situation. And the live was a moment, an exaggeration of the atmosphere, but you turn it into a judgment because you love to label people. If you're going to judge me for a phrase at a party, at least accept that what bothers you isn't ethics. It's that I dare to live without asking your permission. Update 2. 3 days have passed since the last update, and the feeling of walking on glass became routine. Without cards, with Simon turned into an administrative enemy, and with my mother playing moral police from Ecuador, what was a content trip became a test of aesthetic endurance. I woke up with my heart racing at the simple sound of a notification, because it was no longer just my feed, it was my survival. The hotel bill kept accumulating charges. Room service was no longer a whim, but a dangerous temptation. And Brian, although still in a good mood, was starting to look at prices as if they were a personal insult. I tried to maintain the vibe with smiles, but inside I knew that at any moment reality would impose itself like a bill. Simon wasn't content with exposing me and involving my mother. Now he was hinting that he would contact the brands I tag, as if my work were a toy store where he could break things because he's upset. He sent me a very long message talking about consequences, responsibility, and I won't let you keep lying. And I read it with a mix of anger and disgust, because what infuriates me most about moralistic people is that they feel like heroes when they're just being vengeful. I replied with strategic calm. I told him not to dare sabotage me because that would be real damage, not a friendship tantrum. And he replied with a "pay me then," as if he were talking to a cashier. That's when I understood that the friendship was suspended and all that remained was damage control, because if he touched my collaborations, my immediate future would collapse. That's when I made a decision that, honestly, was brilliant in terms of dignity: monetize Brian's presence. If I was trapped in Brazil without financial tools, the logical thing was to turn the trip into a tangible asset. And Brian, with his raw aesthetic and that authenticity that is valued here, could be a quick source of money. I knew there were talent agencies in Rio that hunt for faces, bodies, and vibe for campaigns. And I also knew that if I positioned myself well, I could become his manager and creative director. I have the eye, I have the vision, I'm the one who understands the digital market, and he's ultimately the perfect mannequin for that urban guy narrative conquering Brazil. My plan was simple: get him in advance, pay Simon to shut him up, and maintain the trip without the crisis being noticed. Convincing Brian was easier than I expected because he loves the idea of being discovered, of someone telling him he has something. I sold it as a status adventure. I told him we could leave there with a real opportunity, that this was international content. And he got excited instantly. I put together a quick look for him with what we had. I adjusted his chain, asked him not to overdo it with vulgar phrases, and told him to let me talk first because I understand pitch. He looked at me with that mix of confidence and condescension, as if I were his stylist and his girlfriend at the same time, and I took it as an advantage. When a man gets carried away, you can direct him. We arrived at the agency, and from the first second, I felt the place smelled of silent judgment. It was a clean, minimalist space, with people who look as if they're evaluating a product, and I was ready to play that game. I introduced myself as manager and creative director with a confidence that wasn't acted, because if there's one thing I know how to do, it's sell a story. I told them about my positioning ability, how I build visual narratives, how Brian fit the trend of authenticity, how we could generate international engagement. I thought I was shining because I have presence, I have discourse, I have control. And initially they seemed interested. They nodded, asked questions, looked at Brian as if he were a rare piece, But the disgusting twist was that the interest was in him, not in me. And I understood it when the casting director looked me up and down with that coldness only people who feel they own taste have. He shamelessly told me that my aesthetic was too filtered and generic, as if I were a configuration error. He said it with that false professional neutrality, as if describing the weather. And it burned inside me because it wasn't a technical criticism, it was a blow to my identity. He finished me off by saying they preferred authenticity and that I, according to him, didn't fit that line. And then he asked me to wait outside. Outside, as if I were a secretary for my own project. I froze for a second from the humiliation and the absurdity that in Brazil they would expel me from a room for being too curated, when literally that's what the internet pays for. Brian, instead of being outraged for me, puffed up like a proud peacock. I saw it. I saw his chest rise, how he smiled that I knew it smile, and a cold anger filled me because I brought him there. I prepared him. I built the context for him. I tried to go back in, tried to remind the director that I was part of the creative proposal, but they cut me off with a gesture as if I were noise. Brian stayed inside, and I was left in a waiting room staring at a white wall, listening to laughter and words in Portuguese that sounded like mockery. I couldn't explode there because exploding makes you problematic, and I needed to maintain control, even though inside I wanted to scream. When he finally came out, he came out different, as if he had already tasted a future without me. He showed me the contract almost without looking at me and told me they signed him on the spot for his exotic authenticity, a phrase that disgusted me because they were using him as a human souvenir. The worst part was they gave him a cash advance, right there in bills, as if they were rewarding a dog for a trick. I felt relief because my plan was partly being fulfilled. There was money, real money, and I could finally pay Simon and shut that poisonous mouth. I asked Brian to give me the cash to organize it, not as an imposition, but as a logical act, because I was the one who knew how to distribute it. And he looked at me with a slow smile, one of those that announce betrayal. That's when the stab came, and it was more insulting for being so theatrical. Brian told me I didn't fit into his new stage, that he was on another level now, and he said it as if repeating a phrase someone taught him. He literally pointed out that I was too controlling, that I dimmed him, that I didn't vibrate with his new path as if my structure was a defect. I tried to maintain composure, told him not to be ridiculous, that I had brought him there, that without me he wouldn't even have found the agency, but he was already high on validation. He told me he needed a woman who understood him in Brazil. And in the hallway appeared a Garada model, tall, easy laugh, zero interest in details, and I understood that this was already decided. He took his things, kept the cash, and left as if I were a past stage of his life, not the architect of his opportunity. I was left alone in the hotel with the pending room service bill, penniless, cardless, with Simon threatening from afar, and with the man who was my international content turned into someone else's product. I had to go down to reception with a calm I didn't feel, explain there was a temporary problem, that I needed time, and the receptionist looked at me with that pity that makes you feel worse than an insult. At that moment, my phone vibrated again, and it was Simon, insisting on his money, as if the universe was mocking me, synchronizing humiliation and collection. I was literally in Brazil without access to anything. And yet, the only crime they saw was that I wasn't paying him on time. The immediate consequence was obvious. I was trapped, and the new threat was worse, because now I had neither Brian, nor the cash, nor backup, and the real possibility of being stranded began to feel too tangible. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, your plan worked perfectly. You turned your boyfriend into an ATM, and he traded you for a Garada. Aesthetics don't pay bills, Valentina. Now let's see if your filter comes off. Opie's reply, how easy it is to mock when you don't understand industry dynamics or how casting works. What happened was betrayal and an abuse of power. And if you celebrate it, it says more about your hunger to see someone fall than my supposed lack of humility. Besides, Brian didn't trade me. He let himself be manipulated by people who see Latinos as exoticism. And I'm not going to carry other people's stupidity as if it were my fault. Anonymous user 2 says, Simon lent you money for an operation and you were screaming fuck poverty in a live stream. Now they've made you truly poor and you're still looking for culprits. Karma with subtitles. Opie's reply, I'm impressed by how obsessed you are with a phrase taken out of context, because it's more comfortable to attack me for that than to accept that Simon was the first to act like a stalker. What you call karma is simply envious people taking advantage of a vulnerable moment to feel superior. If I were at the top, you'd be saying I'm an inspiration. Since I'm in a crisis, you want to moralize me, and I'm not buying that double standard. Update 3. 18 months have passed since the last update, and if I could erase an entire stage of my life, like you delete a poorly uploaded story, I'd do it without batting an eye. Returning from Brazil was an aesthetically unpleasant process, one of those that forces you to see your life without filters in the white light of reality. To begin with, I had to accept that I couldn't stay there playing the martyr because no one was coming to rescue me. Simon wasn't going to soften, my mother wasn't going to back down, and Brian was already busy being the new star of another world. I got a return ticket as best I could in survival mode, and at that moment I understood that for the first time, my personal brand wasn't an asset, it was a burden. All the content I had built didn't serve as a shield, because the internet doesn't pay tickets when you fall. The most humiliating blow was having to sell my Instagram account, my real account, with my 40K followers, to an auto parts store. Sometimes I tell this and people think I'm exaggerating, but it was literal. A mechanical parts business bought my profile because they needed cheap reach and I needed fast cash. It was like handing over my identity for a pile of bills, and although it was a smart decision to get out of the hole, it felt like ripping a part of me out. The worst part is that the next day, I no longer existed in my own space. My name became posts about lubricants and tires. I saw my old feed transformed into promotions, and it gave me a mix of anger and emptiness because my aesthetic had ended up selling screws. That was the first real lesson. The audience isn't yours. It's a resource that moves to the highest bidder. With that money, I could pay for the ticket and return half to Simon. Not because he deserved compassion, but because I needed to cut the narrative that I don't pay. I naively thought that with that he would lower the intensity, that he would at least acknowledge the effort, but Simon was no longer playing friend, he was playing judge. He sued me anyway, and it wasn't a symbolic lawsuit, it was real, one of those that puts a stamp on you and forces you to reorganize your life. When I received the notification, I felt an enormous fury, because it was as if he wanted to punish me beyond the money, as if he needed to see me subdued. And of course, in his mind, he was the hero recovering his dignity, but in real life, he was just making sure I could never get back on my feet quickly. The result of that lawsuit was that 30% of my current salary was legally garnished, a percentage that sounds fair on paper, but in practice suffocates you. I had to get a stable job and ended up as a receptionist in a dermatology clinic, which is a cruel irony because I spend my days seeing people get treatments I can no longer afford. I greet them with a professional smile, schedule their appointments, offer them coffee, and inside my stomach burns to see the world still buying beauty while I count coins. Every time someone asks about a very expensive procedure, I remember the Valentina who planned international content, and I feel like laughing at myself, but I don't because that laugh would be admitting defeat. I still believe it was a temporary fall, even if the legal system tries to make it permanent. My relationship with my mother remained strange, tense, because she behaved as if her punishment had been an act of educational love. She tells me that thanks to that I learned, as if learning were the same as being humiliated. I don't forgive her for leaving me without support in a foreign country, and she doesn't forgive me for not asking permission to live my life. We talk, yes, because family isn't cut off so easily, but there's always a shadow in the conversation, a silent reminder that when I fell, she chose morality over protection, and that changes how you look at your own blood. I became more careful with what I tell, what I show, what I allow. With Simon, what remained was a cold, contractual relationship, and that's what I find most unfair, because he turned years of friendship into a case. He presents himself as an exemplary victim and paints me as a manipulative monster. And people believe him because he speaks calmly and I speak with intensity. Life rewards the right tone, not emotional truth. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if he had been less theatrical, if he had accepted that I was in a growth phase and had given me space. But he needed control and I needed expansion. It was an inevitable war. The worst part is that in his version, he saved me from myself, when in reality, he chained me to the past. And yet, Because the law backs him, I have to smile and pay. But the true ironic karma is on the billboards, because Brian, the man who left me stranded in Brazil, is now the official face of a famous Brazilian beer brand. I saw him for the first time on a giant screen and felt such a strong pang that I was breathless for a second. There he was, laughing on the beach with a global campaign, with the kind of success I had envisioned, but without me. And the most insulting thing is that photo, the image that catapulted him. I took it with my iPhone that day. My hand, my eye, my framing, my direction. The industry swallowed my vision and spat out my name. When I found out what came next, I almost laughed at how cruel the universe can be. Simon is Brian's official accountant. Yes, Simon, the man who treated me like a criminal for $5,000, ended up associated with Brian to protect his fortune. They became partners because the world loves those alliances that seem morally clean. Simon now talks about business and responsibility while managing the money of someone who left everything for a garada. And that seems like a complete mockery to me. I imagine Simon telling Brian that you have to invest, that you have to save, that you have to think about the future, as if he hadn't learned anything about loyalty, only about control. And Brian, of course, must be delighted because now he has structure without having to listen to my ideas. I ended up being the receptionist who has to see her ex's face on every corner while scheduling appointments for rich ladies. And that's the kind of slow humiliation that you don't overcome with motivational phrases. Sometimes a patient comes in talking about how incredible that beer campaign is, and I have to nod as if I were just another spectator. Other times a coworker shows me a video of Brian in an interview, and I have to feign indifference when inside I want to scream that I started that career. That's the most disgusting part, being invisible in front of something you helped build. My life became small because of a narrative management error and because of the pettiness of people who claim to be my support. Today I'm still paying the garnishment, I'm still working, I'm still looking at billboards, and I'm still thinking that all this would have been avoided if people understood that image is capital. My problem wasn't wanting to grow, it was trusting people who didn't understand my vision and who, instead of talking to me, chose to punish me. The immediate consequence is that I'm trapped in a life that feels borrowed, with a percentage of my salary going to someone who now lives off other people's accounts. And the new threat, though it sounds ridiculous, is that every time I see Brian succeed with my photo, I feel like doing something impulsive to reclaim my place, because oblivion is the only thing I truly fear. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, you sold your Instagram to auto parts and now you schedule appointments at a clinic. That's not karma, it's consequences. You lied, stole, and played the victim, and finally the world made you pay without filters. OP's reply, you love to say consequence, as if that's synonymous with justice, when in reality it's just an elegant way of saying you enjoy my downfall. I didn't steal. I took an opportunity with a loan that turned into a war due to Simon's ego and public voyeurism. And if you think losing an account and a percentage of my salary defines me, it's because you need a woman to be punished to feel at peace with your own small lives. Anonymous user 2 says, Brian's a millionaire with your photo, Simon's his accountant, and you're garnished. This seems written by the universe to teach you that using people is expensive. Nobody owes you anything, Valentina. OP's reply, the universe doesn't teach, people decide, and you romanticize cruelty as if it were a parable. Brian isn't a genius, he's a lucky opportunist. Simon isn't a saint, he's a resentful man in a suit. And I'm not the villain, you need to simplify the story. Just because nobody owes me anything doesn't mean I have to applaud how my vision is distributed while they look down on me.